Coming up in a few weeks, I've got the privilege of presenting on the bonus stage at the Midwest Gaming Classic for the second time, thanks to Tiger Chainsaw, who's producing the bonus stage. So if you're not familiar with him, go give his channel a look, because he's a good dude. I've probably mentioned presenting at MGC a few times now, but rather than just random promotion, this time I actually have a tie into today's review, because it's how I decided on which game to review this week. Not to spoil too much, but the theme of this year's presentation is games that appeared on both the Genesis and the Master System. And with over 100 titles in that list, obviously I'm not going to be covering all of them in a 30-minute time span. And never mind the fact that I haven't played all of them yet, so I can't really authentically talk about all of them. But I will be trying to hit some highlights and especially cover games that I have previously reviewed on the channel, with the loose idea of putting them into categories based on how the two versions of the game compare. And then also pointing out releases where you might think the same game was released on both consoles, but in actuality the games were very different. For instance, Sonic the Hedgehog and Shadow Dancer. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are wondering when I'm going to get to the point of this intro. Patience, grasshopper. Hi, my name is Dave and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where, yes, one of the categories on the talk is going to be games where you shouldn't waste your time with either version. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Anyway, one of the games out there that's somewhat noteworthy for having versions on both consoles is Castle of Illusion. However, like Sonic the Hedgehog, I'm not sure if it should be included on the list because the versions are somewhat different. Either way, I haven't gotten around to reviewing any of the games in the Illusion series yet on the channel, so I figured now was as good a time as any to at least start reviewing them, and then maybe in the process of doing this review, it'll help me decide if it should be included or instead be a notable exception in the presentation, which is less than a month from now, and I'm still in the workshopping phase. Yikes. Anyway, I refer to the Illusion series there because it is a lot more than just one game. While everything started when Castle of Illusion was released on the Genesis just ahead of Christmas of 1990, the game was popular enough to spawn 4 follow-ups. The Master System version a few months later, which was also one of the last Master System games released in the United States, and then back onto the Genesis for World of Illusion, which added Donald Duck to the mix, fresh off of his appearance in Quackshot, and then finally back on the Master System and Game Gear for Land of Illusion and Legend of Illusion to close the series out. That is, at least until Castle of Illusion itself got a modern remake in 2013 on the Xbox 360 and PS3. This review, though, is for that original Castle of Illusion on the Genesis. Is it going to hold up to my memories of it being a fantastic platformer? Am I going to finally beat it this time around? Or am I going to realize that maybe it's not as good as I remember it? Well, we shall see, but first, a look at this package. And here's my copy of Castle of Illusion for the Genesis. I have no clue when I bought this, but I'm going to assume it was most likely pretty early on in the collection because of my memories of playing it as a kid. And I'm sure like Streets of Rage or Revenge of Shinobi, I probably jumped on it as soon as I saw a decent copy. And this copy is in really good condition. About the only points we can really deduct on it is the hang tab being removed at the top of the case, but even that was done cleanly, so there's no ugly jagged edges or anything like that. Other than that, no surface scratching, no edge wear, and no sun bleaching or water damage. Being that this was a big hit for Sega, they sold a ton of copies of it, so it's not super valuable, but it's not cheap either, with complete copies going currently for between $50 and $60 or so. As far as that front cover art goes, I think this is an iconic cover in the Genesis library, and it's definitely one that I think of when I visualize the early days of the console. The art probably makes it look a little spookier than most of the game actually merits, considering for the most part it's a very bright and colorful game. But throwing that out, it's well drawn and gives off this aura of, what is the Castle of Illusion? Who is that witch in the background? And what adventures might be in store for Mickey here? Which is exactly what you want for trying to draw kids in to be curious about the game. The European cover is pretty much the same, with just the exception of it being cropped slightly different because the art goes all the way to the edges, and even the Japanese version pretty much has the exact same art, just with a red, white, and blue background, possibly to highlight the American nature of Mickey Mouse. If I had to pick, I think I'd go with the Genesis version here. It's just what I'm used to. Flipping over the back, and we've got the early Genesis formatting with one large screenshot at the top and two smaller ones down below. Said screenshots are of great quality, especially for the era, and make the game look fantastic, although they probably went a little bit too far with the fake TV screen edge and cutting off the bottom of the image. Regardless of that though, each is from a different level, and especially that first shot, with Mickey jumping for the swinging rope over the mushrooms, as the kids say, goes hard. The flavor text on the side is solid as well, although I've got to say, it's a tad wordy. There's a lot of text back there for a game aimed at kids. One particular part sticks out to me though. Mickey must find 7 gems hidden in the fantastic chambers and underground mazes of Miserable's Castle of Illusion and use them to save Minnie. Collecting 7 gems in a platformer. Why does that sound familiar? Opening up the package, and the cartridge and manual are in great shape, just like the outside. The manual has that classic Sega formatting, and one thing I really appreciate, an actual introduction to the game on the first 2 pages that explains the backstory. Granted, some of this is covered in the in-game intro, but it's still nice to have it here fleshed out. The rest of the manual does a good job of explaining the mechanics of what you're doing and giving a summary of each of the levels in the game, and while it's a pretty simple game that doesn't really need a whole lot of explanation, there are some nice little details in here, like how many points does it take to get an extra life, and how many continues do you get depending on the difficulty level. Regardless of how necessary it is, it's just nice to see the publisher giving a crap, unlike what we saw last week with Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits. Okay, that's the package. Let's enter the castle and see what peril is in store for Mickey. At its core, Castle of Illusion is a relatively simple idea. Take a popular cartoon character in Mickey Mouse and create a platforming game around him trying to rescue Minnie, who just happens to be trapped in a castle. I mean, it worked for Mario and Princess Toadstool, or Peach, so why not just rerun it here? Replacing Bowser in this case is the witch Miserable. Miserable, and I'm going to say it slowly so you get it, Miserable, isn't a specific character from Disney history, but instead essentially a re-imaging of the evil queen from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, complete with 2 forms, an ugly hag form, her natural appearance, and then a fair form, which she is trying to make permanent by stealing energy from Minnie Mouse. This is a place where we should probably make a distinction in how the game came about. At this point in time, Disney was not producing their own video games, and as such, the characters of Mickey and Minnie Mouse were licensed from Disney to Sega to create the game. And I'm sure that same licensing agreement allowed Sega to create Miserable as analogous to the Evil Queen without Disney giving them too much crap about it. But it should be pointed out that in reality, since this was a Sega production, the only characters in-game that actually have a base in Disney lore are Mickey and Minnie. There's no other enemies or bosses/sub-bosses that come from Disney properties, and no other Disney characters in the story. In fact, the only other non-enemy character is just a mysterious person at the beginning of the game that claims to be the original king of the castle, who explains to Mickey what's going on and how to save Minnie. While I think it would have been nice to have had a slightly more involved story, or perhaps have a closer tie to the world of Disney, in the case of Castle of Illusion, getting straight to the action and not overcomplicating things works in the game's favor, and it certainly makes for a more engaging experience than how Goofy's Hysterical History Tour approached things, where rather than getting to the action, you're presented with 5 minutes of exposition via cutscene. It makes the game feel like it was produced by people that knew video games, rather than people that produced movies or television shows, and that's a good thing. As far as who actually produced the game goes, well, technically that would be Sega's R&D 6 group. By 1989, due to various internal moves, R&D 6 was staffed by former members of R&D 2, which you may not know by name due to how the games were created back in the day, but if you're a fan of the Master System, you've probably played something that they worked on, as they created over 50 titles on that platform. Eventually splitting off of Sega R&D 2 was also Sega R&D 9, which you're probably more familiar with as being the first incarnation of Sonic Team. I mention all this because I'm going to make a bold claim here. Sonic the Hedgehog would not exist as constructed without Castle of Illusion. Now, I'm not saying that I'm the only person to think that. I'm sure someone else probably has at least alluded to the similarities in the titles over the years, but it's clear that even if the games weren't specifically developed by the exact same people, there was clearly at least some resource sharing going on amongst the teams. In the package section, I dropped a not-so-subtle hint about this where I mentioned that the idea of Mickey having to collect 7 rainbow-colored gems might have been seen elsewhere. And of course, I was referring to Sonic's goal of having to collect the various colored Chaos Emeralds to defeat Dr. Robotnik. And while that similarity can certainly be waved off as a bit of a coincidence, especially since in Castle of Illusion you just gain the gems as you proceed through the game, and there's no special stages involved, there's other links between the games as well. For instance, some of these sound effects that you hear in Castle of Illusion are reused in Sonic the Hedgehog. Certain enemies, such as the bat and the bony fish, share a striking resemblance to their robot counterparts in Sonic. The design of the eyes on the Nutcracker soldiers in the second level match up with Sonic's eyes. In that same level, there are boxes that move up and down in a pattern that would be later replicated in portions of the Spring Yard Zone. And in the final castle area of the game, there's horizontal and vertical gears along with plungers that clearly inspired some of the designs that would be later used in Scrap Brain Zone. And I'm sure that I'm probably missing certain other things as well, and this doesn't even include smaller things, like the section of the third level, The Storm, where Mickey has to navigate a rushing river, similar to some of the water in the Labyrinth Zone, or the waterfalls in that same level that come rushing down the screen, similar to some of the lava flows that must be avoided in Marble Zone. The point is, had Castle of Illusion not paved the way, Sonic the Hedgehog would be a very different experience. But having said that, while certain elements are shared between the two games, Castle of Illusion should not be considered Sonic the Hedgehog 0 or anything ridiculous like that. It's very much its own game with its own platforming sensibilities. Number one amongst those is that it's certainly not a gotta go fast game. To that point, there's no time limit in the game, which encourages players to take their time and be smart about how they navigate the various levels. Which is important because, unlike Sonic, there's no golden ring to give you a get out of jail free card if you take a hit. In the default difficulty, Mickey can survive 2 hits before losing a life, but he can also gain health as he proceeds through the level, assuming he grabs certain power-ups, up to 5 units. This becomes a key mechanic because Mickey won't be able to regain health during boss fights, and there's no checkpoints in each of the level sections. If Mickey dies, he has to start all the way over from the beginning of that section. For the most part, and especially in normal mode, not having checkpoints isn't that big a deal because the game is relatively easy. Sure, there's going to be times when it's the first few times that you're playing a level, or your first attempt or two at a boss, that you might have some difficulties, but usually in those instances, once you know what to expect, making your way through the level should be smooth sailing. Part of this is due to the fact that most of the enemies are dispatched easily, with all of them just taking a single hit. And then there's also that there's just not that many enemies in the levels to begin with. But some of the credit here has to go to just how well the game controls. It's essentially perfect. Whenever Mickey jumps in the air to land on a specific platform, he's going to land that jump unless the player is simply being careless and going too fast. Every single time something bad happened to me in the game, I could chalk it up to one of two things. Either something happened that I didn't expect because I hadn't been to that part of the level yet, or I made a silly mistake. There's no blaming the computer for cheating or poor controls here, and so it's nice to play a game that does exactly what you expect it to and doesn't require an insane amount of precision. As far as the controls are concerned, I think one of the reasons why the game can be tuned as well as it is because the controls are relatively simple. Mickey's primary attack is jumping on top of enemies and performing a butt bounce by pressing down on the D-pad, and this attack can be used strategically as well to reach higher areas by holding down on the jump button, something to keep in mind if you're trying to reach hidden or otherwise difficult to reach items. Along with that, Mickey can also throw items at enemies, but in a nice twist, Mickey doesn't just have unlimited ammo. He has to collect items as he goes through the level, similar to the bonus items in Castlevania. This makes the beginnings of the levels, before he collects any items, a little more interesting, because at that point he'll have to either use a bounce or just avoid the enemies. But that's it. No other special items, no power-ups aside from points or the very rare extra life. That simplicity might seem a bit boring by 2025 standards, but honestly, I love it, and I think it works perfectly for the game. From a graphics perspective, I think the developers nailed the design. The animation is top-notch, and it looks very much like a cartoon and something that would have come from Walt Disney Animation Studios. Of course, later games like, say, Aladdin would take the cartoon-like animations to the next level, but let's remember where we are at the time. It's December of 1990, and the Genesis has been out in the United States for less than 18 months, with only about 50 total titles in its library, so things are still very early. And, as was common at the time, Castle of Illusion is all packed into just a 4 megabit cartridge, but even with that limitation, the developers were able to make a game packed with the aforementioned great animations, but also include some truly great uses of color and pack in some nice graphical effects, highlighted by parallax scrolling of backgrounds, dithering, and a nice trick in the Toyland level where the screen can be flipped upside down. However, the achievement doesn't just stop at the graphics. With that relatively small 4 megabit ROM limit we've seen on the channel in previous reviews, where developers had to prioritize, and usually that meant that most of the room went to the graphics, leaving the audio as an afterthought, ending up with just whatever they could squeeze into the remaining room. Not so here. The music is fantastic, with a great choice of not just synths, but also composition, with each of the music tracks fitting the level they're attached to perfectly. And as mentioned, some of the sound effects were good enough to be reused in other titles, so clearly they got those right. But even without that, I think one of the most striking things to me was, as soon as I heard some of the sound effects, like for instance Mickey bouncing on a mushroom, that sound took me back to when I played the game as a kid, so clearly they left a lasting impression, but in a good way. That sound composition credit goes to Kamiya Studio, aka Shigenori Kamiya, but it should also be pointed out that a sound director credit goes to Bo, aka Tokuhiko Uwabo, one of the most accomplished composers and sound designers Sega had in the era. You may not realize that Uwabo had a hand in some pretty notable games before working on Castle of Illusion. Perhaps you've heard of Phantasy Star, Ys the Vanished Omens, and Phantasy Star 2, while also working hand in hand with a certain Yuzo Koshiro on The Revenge of Shinobi. The point is, I think Sega knew how important the Walt Disney license was here, so they clearly got some of their A-squad programmers and designers to work on the game, and the results show. After playing the game this past week, and probably putting more hours into it than I originally planned, I came to the conclusion that there's really only one problem with it, and that's that it's too short. I wonder if perhaps the original plan for the game was to have it broken into 7 levels, with a gem for each level, and then, as they were working on it, the decision was made to cut some of the originally planned content, because it's pretty weird to get 2 of the items without even fighting bosses. For instance, it feels like that maybe originally the Candyland sections of the library were originally their own level, but then everything was compressed into one. But all of that is very nitpicky, and it should be pointed out that there is a hard difficulty that you can choose to give yourself a bit more of a challenge if you want to lengthen your time with the game. To me, Castle of Illusion is the whole package. It's fun, it looks and sounds great, and it controls like a dream. This is a game that should be in everyone's Genesis library, and due to that, I'm giving it 4 stars. If you haven't played it before, I would definitely give it a shot, especially if you like platformers. And that's it for Castle of Illusion for the Genesis. I get all the people out there that might dismiss this as being a little bit on the easy side, but it's not like you can just sleepwalk through it. And if your game got a modern remake 20 years after the fact, clearly there was a reason why there was enough interest to make that a viable game after all of those years. My main takeaway from the game is that I want more, which is always a sign of a great title, and it's definitely on my short list of what games will be part of the top 10 at the end of the year. I'm really looking forward to playing the Master System version. I've heard so much about how great a game it is, and I kind of like the idea of playing a slightly different game. I mean, I've already played this version of Castle of Illusion. While it's cool to push the Master System to its limits and see just how good of a job they can do with a port, at the end of the day, the best case scenario is just that you're playing the same game again. Next time on the channel, it's back to the Master System, and hopefully my Master System 2 behaves a little better this time around. We'll see, but regardless of whatever technical hurdles are in the background, I'll be reviewing a game that I've never played before due to it originally being a PAL region exclusive, despite the fact that it came out in 1989, while the Master System was still alive and well in the United States. Well, alive anyway. I'm not sure you could ever really say it was well here. Not sure what was up with that other than Sega was focusing on the Genesis launch at the time, so maybe they didn't want the two to battle. Regardless, I'm very hopeful for good things with this game because I'm a huge fan of the arcade game that's always mentioned when someone talks about it. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 275. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.